Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis Badenmare. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. And we have a really interesting conversation for you today. We're in conversation today with Ronnie Cummins. He's the International Director of Organic Consumers Association and one of the founders of Regeneration International. And today he'll be talking with Dr. Meryl Nass. Meryl Nass is a medical doctor who has testified before Congress, lending her expertise to a number of issues related to biological warfare and vaccines and how to handle pandemics. So she has vast expertise in the subject of COVID-19. And we're going to be talking to her about something that you won't hear a lot about in the mainstream press. We are going to be analyzing the COVID-19 pandemic for whether it perhaps is a man-made situation, and also whether our public health officials are adequately dealing with this situation. So I want to turn it first to Meryl. I want Meryl to tell us a little bit about how she developed this expertise. She was called into Zimbabwe in the late 1980s. In the late 1970s, there was an anthrax outbreak in Zimbabwe. And pretty soon there were allegations that this anthrax outbreak was extraordinary in a number of ways and may have been man-made. Through this investigation, she learned how to analyze a disease outbreak to see if it was of natural origin or man-made. And so that, with Meryl telling us the story, we'll have an idea about this expertise and how it applies to COVID-19. So Meryl, can you walk us through this unique experience that you
I don't know if it's that simple. Let me just say that I was a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility in the late 80s in Amherst, Mass, and went to a meeting, and UMass students had, with a professor, had discovered that professors at the university were doing research that might be related to germ warfare, what was called germ warfare at the time. And let me just let the listeners know that the names of things are often changed so that to confuse you. So germ warfare became biological warfare, and now it's sometimes pandemic preparedness, but it's basically all the same thing. Anyway, there was a researcher doing work on an anthrax vaccine, and I wasn't convinced that that was germ warfare. And people argued with me, and I wound up being assigned the task of reading his contract, reading his curriculum vitae, his resume, and seeing what he was doing. And when I did, I discovered that his contract had nothing to do with the vaccine. It had been titled vaccine research, basically to hide what it was, which was a primitive form of genetic engineering of anthrax, creating new anthrax strains. And so this was in 1989. And I decided, wow, if they're hiding this kind of work, maybe there have been uses of anthrax. Anthrax is really rare. We hadn't even taught about it in medical school. So I decided to research, I just picked an arbitrary number, the last 15 years of anthrax outbreaks in the world, and see what had been published, what had happened, and look them over. And when I did that, I found that one stood out. It was the largest, and it was very unusual in its characteristics. And then I spent the next 3 years, I had a regular job and I had 2 kids, but in a lot of spare time, I spent the next 3 years trying to figure out how to prove or identify whether it was biological warfare, and then how to convince other people of that once I had proven it to myself, and published a paper in 1992 about that, presented it at an international conference. And no one had ever done that before, to actually look at the epidemiology, all the different characteristics, the flies that were there, the weather, the rainfall, the borders of the country, and how the epidemic had traveled through the country. So anyway, for anthrax, I have a good way of identifying whether it is an outbreak is due to biological warfare. The thing is that every organism transmits differently and has a different pattern. And so that particular pattern can't be applied to everything. So you have to look at every outbreak and sort of figure out what the natural pattern is, and then compare the pattern you're looking at to see how it fits. In this case, I approached it from a different angle and said, first of all, with SARS-1, which was another very lethal, more lethal actually, outbreak that was primarily in China, just a handful of cases in the US. It occurred in 2002 and 2003. That virus genetically mutated in a certain way after what we think was entering the human population. This one did not mutate in a similar, so that was my only sort of what we think is a natural occurrence. It's possible it wasn't a natural occurrence because there was research into coronaviruses of this beta coronaviruses prior to 2002. So there's a remote possibility that that might have escaped from a lab. But anyway, all that aside, this particular virus was already very well adapted to humans when it appears to have entered the human population. Doesn't seem to have been in humans. If you look at the pattern of how it's mutated over this last year, wasn't in humans before last fall. So that's a little strange. It was well adapted to humans when it arrived. And there are other things, I don't really want to get into them, but there are other features of its genome that suggest it was certain things were maximized or changed from the natural virus in labs. And we have a number of published papers that show that researchers in the US and China and other countries were in fact adapting coronaviruses in these exact same ways as the SARS-2 has demonstrated. So there's a very strong pathway suggesting it was it or a very recent predecessor was developed in a lab.
Thank you. That's a good introduction to this whole topic. I'm trying to follow the conversation on Facebook simultaneously, so I'll be trying to take your questions from Facebook. And if you're watching on Facebook now, please start a watch party. That's the way to share this live video with all of your friends. You don't have to do anything other than click watch party, and a note will go to your friends. And if any of your friends join in, you'll be in a group chat with them and you can discuss this conversation. So now I want to turn it over to Ronnie Cummins, and we're going to talk a little bit about the campaign that he's working on with Dr. Nass. So he and Dr. Nass and others put together a statement it's a statement by scientists, lawyers, and policy experts on why we need a global moratorium on the creation of potential pandemic pathogens through gain of function experiments. So Meryl has talked a little bit about this so far. That's, if you're analyzing a disease outbreak, one of the first, the only reason you would consider whether this disease outbreak might not be natural is if the pathogens are being manipulated in a laboratory, if these pathogens are commonly used in biological weapons programs or in vaccine research or in some other way that they could potentially escape from a lab. And because that, as Meryl talked about, the SARS virus was being manipulated, bat coronaviruses have been collected and manipulated in labs through the use of genetic engineering. This is called gain of function research. But as Meryl was talking about, these terms get switched around by our government and our regulators and our militaries. So what was commonly considered biological weapons research was euphemistically called dual use research of concern, and now commonly goes by the term of gain of function research. So, Ronnie, tell us a little bit about this project you're working on with Meryl and why it's so important to organize scientists and policymakers and lawyers, and what the objective is. Do we need gain of function research? Should we be manipulating viruses in the lab? What does the COVID-19 pandemic tell us about this? I'll turn it over to you, Ronnie.
Okay, just a little bit of introduction of how I got involved in this kind of campaigning. 50 years ago, I got involved in the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. And as we came to understand, there were low intensity wars going on all over the place and had been. And, we did a pretty good job, I think, of educating people about some of the really outrageous foreign policy of the United States, the viciousness of these wars. Simultaneously, we were, riding on the wave of the 1950s, 1960s ban the bomb movement, where people saw the horror of nuclear weapons and said we should get rid of them. But one thing we never did in the anti-nuclear weapons movement, nor the and the anti-nuclear movement of the late 70s, nor the anti-war movement, was we didn't deal properly with chemical and biological weapons. We didn't read that much about them, write about them. We certainly did not tell the public that. And so up until now, I don't think the public is that informed or that concerned about it. And when I saw the anthrax attacks in 2001, shortly after 9/11, and I saw I saw the evidence that it was from a U.S. military lab and that it was used to rush through the Patriot Act, and it was used to really make the entire public panic stricken. I started looking again at chemical and biological warfare, things like Lyme's disease, which are a daily threat to people who live in northern Minnesota, where I live part of the year. The other thing was I got involved 30 years ago in the early stages of campaigning against genetically engineered organisms. We had a group called the Biotechnology Working Group that I was part of back in 1992. And some of our members were like the Council on Responsible Genetics, the Union of Concerned Scientists, Foundation on Economic Trends, and so on and so forth. And although I wasn't a scientist, I learned quite a bit. And what I learned was that genetic engineering, especially if it's unregulated and if it's being run motivated by profit, can be very dangerous. And I decided to dedicate the next 25 years of my campaigning to campaigns against genetically engineered food and crops and the toxic chemicals that accompany them. And so I learned a lot. But I remember back in 92, the scientists were warning not just about genetically engineering foods and crops, they were warning about this, genetically engineering viruses and bacteria and fungi, and that this could turn into a world war and so on. And so when the pandemic started in Wuhan, I immediately got very interested and I started following everything that I could find. And when I saw this interview with Francis Boyle, who's a longtime expert on chemical and biological warfare, on the Mercola.com website, then I became obsessed and I started looking into it. And it became clear that this type of research that they call biomedical research is actually biodefense, it's actually biowarfare, and that there is nothing to stop a terrorist or a government or a person interested in making money from doing this. And that when you look at the Wuhan situation, to me, the preponderance of evidence is that this thing was a lab creation. I hope it was accidentally released. But I was so puzzled in the beginning, how is it possible that the Communist Party of China that the big pharma, that the US military, US government, all the well-known virologists and scientists in the world and journalists, this was a pretty unusual alliance of people who were immediately saying anyone who questions that this wasn't natural evolution is a conspiracy theorist and is dangerous basically. And so the more I got into it, the more I got to this point. So we look back, as we start looking back at the history of weaponizing viruses, of what is called euphemistically gain of function, we saw that there were a bunch of lab leaks around the year 2013, 2014 across the world. A group of scientists called the Cambridge Working Group did an open letter, which they sent to the Obama administration saying that you shouldn't be doing this kind of research unless the public good that was going to come out of it far outweighed the potential dangers. And if it was clearly safe to do this. And so Obama, the administration there, who had been funding gain of function research, just like every other president since the Second World War, Obama's hands were not totally clean, but they at least said, oh, let's pause funding this type of gain of function research in the United States. And let's recommend that people stop doing this, across the board. Well, this letter signed by 320 some odd scientists, I believe had a major impact. So we said, all right.
Jobs will be somewhat or extremely threatened by AI.
Let's see if we can't do this again. Let's take the old wording of the Cambridge Working Group letter calling for a halt on this type of research. Let's bring it up to current time. Let's get a number of well-known scientists and doctors and policy experts who have spoken out against the official story of COVID-19, and let's see if we can't do this again. And at the same time, we said, well, and let's have a petition just for everyday people. And so Organic Consumers Association started that. And through the present time, I just checked, there's 390 signers of scientists, lawyers, policy experts, and then 65,000 everyday people on the parallel petition. And, but we've run into definitely some obstacles in getting this to go viral among scientists. And maybe Meryl can explain why, if you're a virologist or if you're a person doing this genetic engineering or this lab work with viruses and bacteria and other microorganisms, you don't want to sign this. Why they're keeping so quiet about this? Is it because they don't see the preponderance of evidence that others of us see, or is there another reason for the dead silence on the part of establishment scientists about this?
Yes, I think we should acknowledge that there's probably been about at least 10 or a dozen scientists around the world who have said, yes, this does look like it came out of a lab for a lot of reasons. And I think the scientific arguments that they've made have not been refuted. So the quiet virologists who are not jumping up and down saying this came from a lab are also not criticizing people who say that it did come from a lab, with the single exception of Dr. Yan from China, who was brought into this country apparently by Steve Bannon, and has made a lot of politically motivated statements about China, in addition to making claims about the virus. What's interesting to me about Dr. Yan is that she hasn't come up, her arguments about why this came from a lab basically are identical to arguments that have been made by a number of other scientists already. And so I don't think she brings anything new to the table. I don't know who she represents. And I think we should basically ignore her because most of the arguments that she makes are correct. Some are incorrect, but they're irrelevant because other people have made them, and we don't need to think about her. The only people who really, that I've seen, made a big argument saying this couldn't have come from a lab was the Anderson group, a group of 5 scientists who were from all over the world, one from England, one from the East Coast, one from the West Coast, one from Australia, and one from New Orleans, who happens to have a little business down the street from Fort Detrick. And these 5 made a specious argument about why this shouldn't have come from a lab, and other people have taken their argument apart, and Anderson et al. Have not attempted to re-argue it. So there really isn't an outstanding scientific argument that anyone needs to topple for why this had to be a natural event. What's happening instead is that the vast majority of virologists are just keeping their mouths shut. And I think the reason for that is because in the world of today, and particularly in the US, everything has been politicized. So scientists know that they live or die based on the grants they get. And that if you open your mouth and say something that is not politically correct, according to the NIH or the NSF, you are likely to lose future grants, and that's the end of your career. And so I want to point out that this initial letter that Ronnie referenced was a letter signed by about 20 people, some very prominent scientists, in the Lancet, which is the world's top medical journal. And it said, and came online in February, it said, we must not entertain conspiracy theories about this. It was clearly natural. We don't want to interfere with our relationship with China and the ability to fight this pandemic. You know, in other words, if you bring up that it might have come from a lab, China won't help us with, with information about the pandemic. So keep your mouths shut. And that letter was signed by a former head of the National Science Foundation, a former top person at the CDC, and he was also an assistant attorney general, signed by somebody who I believe worked on bioweapons at an NIH lab, signed by Peter Daszak, who has run an organization which, while it claims to be a public health organization interested in preventing pandemics, its main job seems to be to work with scientists in over 30 countries and catch wild animals, particularly bats, in those countries, give them money and get access to their specimens and their research. And it facilitates the sharing of research and information amongst these different countries. And it's important to note that much of their funding comes from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is a sub-agency of the Department of Defense. They also get a lot of money from USAID, which is kind of a spin-off from the State Department and has been a front organization for CIA money. So they also get money from NIH. Tony Fauci has given them money on a number of occasions. They are funded by a vast array of US federal agencies. And although they say that the goal is to prevent it, they want to catch these viruses so they can figure out how to prevent them and treat them, there's no evidence that they've actually funded work in the areas of preventive medicines or treatments, cures, drugs. That's not what they're doing. They're rather studying these, and they found thousands of viruses. And what they seem to be looking for, at least in some of the research that has been funded by Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance, through funding that they got from federal agencies, they have transferred that to the Chinese Wuhan Institute of Virology and other places, found the most virulent viruses, and then genetically engineered them to have even more characteristics of virulence or ability to perhaps defeat the immune system or to enhance the likelihood of autoimmunity. And So anyway, go ahead, ask me something else.
Well, just to summarize what you and Ronnie have been explaining, what the issue that we have here is that the COVID-19 virus supposedly arose from nature. So the official story is that a bat coronavirus somehow spilled over to human beings. And so this has just been floated, but this hasn't been proved in any way. Initially, people said, well, this happened in Wuhan, and it impacted a lot of people who were involved in the Wuhan wet market, who shopped there, who sold products at the wet market. So likely we had, say, pangolins or another animal was
Intermediate host.
animal that, go ahead.
Intermediate host.
Yeah, so supposedly we have this intermediate host, a pangolin or another animal, civet, cat. That's the explanation for the first SARS coronavirus. It was at the market. The animal then infected a human being. A lot of times the story that's told is that there are people who eat animals that should not be eaten. Therefore, they get viruses from animals that human beings have never gotten before. Of course, that argument doesn't make a whole lot of sense because if people have been eating bats or using pangolins in Chinese medicine or eating civet cats for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, why is it now that we suddenly have these worldwide pandemics with these unique coronaviruses that never have come to human beings before? But go ahead, Meryl, take it from here.
So yeah, so Peter Daszak, who is the spokesperson, the lead person for the EcoHealth Alliance, who earns about $400,000 a year, about the same as Trump, has been traveling around to all kinds of science magazines, newspapers, TV, and spreading the story that you just talked about, that human incursions into wildlife are what causes pandemics. And Tony Fauci has now picked up that same story and started repeating it as well. And they've said, as long as humans keep encroaching, if we build roads, if we have mines in areas that were previously unexplored, people weren't living there, we will be causing new pandemics, and we have to stop doing that. Now, but the problem is there's absolutely no evidence that that's true. Okay, so what are the recent pandemics? The 2009 swine flu pandemic was the last one, turned out to be less severe than a normal flu season. It supposedly came from pigs in Mexico, but people have suggested it may have come from a lab as well. And if it came from pigs in Mexico, it came from livestock, not pigs in the wild. All right, the one before that was the 1976 swine flu with pandemic, for which we rapidly developed a vaccine and gave it to 1/4 of the United States population. That particular pandemic fizzled out after infecting less than 10 people. One person died, but he had been on a forced march. He was a military recruit, a young person. And even after there was no more pandemic, and everybody knew, it died out in a few weeks, and yet they continued to manufacture vaccine over a period of about 6 months and then try to give it to the entire US population. And after 1/4 of the Americans got it, there were so many cases of Guillain-Barré, a paralyzing autoimmune condition, that they had to stop. And nobody wanted to talk about the fact that there wasn't that particular virus, did not even exist in the population anymore. So that was that one. There was a 1968 flu pandemic. There was a 1957, I think, flu pandemic. I may have the years wrong by 1 or 2 years. Those were probably natural. Maybe they came from the growing of ducks or chickens in China. That's the usual allegation of how they arise. The recent Ebola epidemic in West Africa, nobody has found a bat with that Ebola in West Africa. Nobody knows where it came from, but very close to the epicenter, there was a US funded biological defense research lab, And strangely enough, its principal investigator, Robert Gary from Louisiana, was one of the signers of the Anderson commentary in Nature Medicine, the one article that said this was a natural occurrence. And here's the argument. He was the final author on that paper. And he was the principal investigator of the lab in Sierra Leone, which was very close to the epicenter of the West African Ebola epidemic. There had never been any Ebola within 1,000 miles of that area previously. I'm talking about the 2014 Ebola epidemic. So there's no evidence that that came from a bat biting a person or a person eating a bat or anything else. We don't know where that came from. Actually, they're a colleague of these folks and another author of that, another co-author of the Anderson paper is Ian Lipkin. And Lipkin's group recently claimed, a year or two ago, claimed that they found a bat that may explain the origin of that Ebola. But it's of great interest to me that this very tiny intertwined group of people who get a lot of money from US biodefense, some of whom have been disinformation spokespeople in the past, Gary and Lipkin have both put out disinformation, and I think so have the others, about HIV, about anthrax vaccine, and about pandemics. So they seem to be hired guns to push the story of human encroachment on bat areas being the problem, when it's at least as likely that it's humans in laboratories that are the problem. Okay, the reason I say that is because we know there have been tons of releases of pathogenic organisms from labs. In the United States alone, there are on average 2 reports a week of a mistake in a lab, a broken piece of glassware, an animal biting a lab worker that has been infected with one of these pathogenic viruses. So the CDC collects about 100 or 200 of these reports every year in the US alone. We know that the CDC itself exposed at least 15 of its workers to live anthrax because it had not effectively inactivated it through its procedures. And that's one of the reasons why there was a halt on this gain of function research in 2014. It was after the CDC had been through the national news, because USA Today had a reporter covering it, all these different problems at the CDC's lab. There were also problems at the Fort Detrick Lab last year. The Fort Detrick Lab, this was another top, it's called biosafety level 4, the highest level of biocontainment. They had problems too. Their lab was closed down. There have been problems at NIH and FDA labs as well. And at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, which was the place, we don't know what it does now, but it was the place where all the biological weapons were tested. For over 10 years, they were inadequately inactivating anthrax and sending what was supposed to be dead anthrax to over 100 labs for testing. And turned out some of it was live. They sent out some live bird flu as well. That's only the United States. So if that's what happens in the United States, we can probably assume that similar things happen in the rest of the world. We know, in fact, that after the first SARS pandemic, researchers in China, Taiwan, and Singapore on at least 4 or 5 occasions had releases of the SARS virus that was being studied in their labs over the next few years, and several people died. So there are a couple of small outbreaks as a result. Those were in Beijing, none of them were in Wuhan, the ones in China. And the 1977 influenza outbreak that year was also due to an escape from a lab. People don't know this. I didn't even know it. But it turned out that that particular version of influenza was the exact same one genetically as one that had been around over 20 years ago, and that never happens. So it's believed that probably when everyone was frightened about a 1976 pandemic, that's when the United States was developing the vaccine for it, the swine flu vaccine, probably China or Russia in that area where the China-Russia border is, probably they were working on pandemic swine flu vaccines as well, and had opened up a bottle of this old virus, and it escaped and it traveled around the world. And so that year, the flu outbreak was due to a flu from over 20 years ago. It sounds amazing, but this is well documented, and certainly I'll help you put up links to it. So given the background that these things occur a lot, that researchers have died in the US, in Russia, in China from lab accidents. They've caught the things they're studying and died, multiple times. People are not informed about that. But so lab leaks, it seems, do occur and may well start a pandemic.
Wow, that's overwhelming information, Meryl. It's really scary to think that, not only are we experiencing this pandemic, but research is being done all over the world. The Pentagon itself has 30 biological labs. Some people would say biological weapons labs all over the world, experimenting with viruses to make them more deadly to human beings. And at any point, we could have a lab leak, like the lab leak that is suspected at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that was very close to where this pandemic originated. So I want to ask Ronnie about that issue. So I'm watching the chat in Facebook, and there are some people who think that China deliberately released this virus. That's certainly what Dr. Li Mengyang from Hong Kong has accused China of doing. She's been on Tucker Carlson on Fox News. I think she's the best known advocate of this lab release theory, but she's saying that it was a deliberate release. And then you have folks saying, well, the United States is running a covert biological weapons program. We know that the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases is funding research to make bat viruses specifically more deadly to human beings, or to make these bat viruses actually able to infect human beings when they weren't able to be infected before. So Ronnie, I'd like you to weigh in on this. I know we don't really have the evidence one way or the other, but what do you say to this political conversation that folks are having? Some people, I guess the Chinese government says it's the United States government. The US government, Mike Pompeo, for instance, has accused China of doing this. We have an investigation. The National Institutes of Health has asked EcoHealth Alliance to respond to a bunch of questions about whether this release came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What do you make of this conversation, Ronnie? Is it possible to place blame, and what's the evidence on either side of that conversation?
Well, at this point, I think it's very important to look at the preponderance of evidence. Was this natural evolution, or was this a lab leak? Let's settle that question in terms of the preponderance of evidence. When the smoking gun is held by the Chinese government, and where they have intimidated and imprisoned and disappeared scientists who tried to speak up about this, I don't think the Chinese are not going to come clean with, okay, come on into Wuhan lab and our CDC lab, and we'll let you look at all the notebooks of all the researchers. We'll show you all our collection of viruses, and we'll come clean. They're not going to do that. And so we're likely never to have that kind of information anytime soon. So first thing is, let's establish, and I believe it is being established worldwide, this was not a natural evolution. Okay. And if you look at things like, I talked about how under pressure and after lab accidents, the Obama administration put a temporary partial hold on this type of research. Well, guess who spoke out against this pause in research funding? Well, Anthony Fauci. Fauci played the same role under the Obama administration as he did in the Bush administration, as he does in the Trump administration. He's the cheerleader for this type of research. So he told Obama he didn't agree with a pause on gain of function or gain of threat research. And then, okay, so the pause went into effect. Well, what happened? Well, Fauci's National Institutes of Health, they started funding, or they continued funding, the Wuhan lab. So something that was supposed to be banned in the US or stopped, they simply continued that same research at the Wuhan lab. Okay. And so, what scares me is that 85% of Democrats think Fauci is great, and that 60 some odd percent of Republicans, and that Fauci is the biggest proponent out there that, okay, we've got this horrible pandemic going on. There is no prevention. There is no treatment except a vaccine, which is going to come, and then everything will be all right. Well, I mean, this is the guy who was funding the lab that the preponderance of evidence points to. I mean, it could have been the CDC lab in Wuhan. But I'm not saying that it couldn't have been the US. One point I'd like to make is some evidence came out in May. It was repeated widely and even in the mass media. It said that there were monitoring of cell phone activity, at the Wuhan lab. And, there's all this cell phone activity on a regular basis and so on. And all of a sudden, around the 1st of October, there was a drastic decrease in cell phone activity, simultaneously at the same time as satellite photography showed roadblocks around the Wuhan lab, and traffic being rerouted. Okay. If this evidence, if there's validity to it, how come our CIA and our military haven't confirmed this? I mean, there were leaks in the press that all the different intelligence agencies from Australia and the US, the quote allies, had the same information. Okay, why would not the CIA say, oh yeah, we were monitoring cell phone activity too, and we were doing satellite photography of the traffic, and we saw the same thing? Okay, well, it starts to make sense when you see that the US military and security services were funding this type of research around the world. What it looks like is that a joint project to weaponize viruses in Wuhan under the guise of biomedicine or vaccine research went awry some kind of way. No one wants to admit what happened. Of course, the Chinese government don't want to admit what happened. The US government doesn't really want to admit what happened. The military doesn't want to admit what happened. And Trump, Trump never said anything other than something to rile up his base. I mean, did you ever hear Trump say, well, this kind of research was banned for funding in the US under Obama, and then I started it up again, and we were funding what was going on in Wuhan?
That's
Trump
right.
has not said that, and he's not going to say that. And so I think we're in a very dangerous situation because this was a lab release, or it's possible there were, international military games happened right at this same time in October. The Chinese say that's when the US released this, or one of their enemies, Taiwan or whomever it was. But whoever accidentally or deliberately release this, we need to stop this from happening in the future. This is not just a question of banning gain of function. It's like we're facing issues now like the climate emergency. You know, the potential for nuclear war is still there. You know, this pandemic production is still there. We are not going to survive if we don't cut through the nonsense and sit down and have an international discussion about this. We need to cooperate with the Russian government. We need to cooperate with the Chinese government. We need to cooperate with all the governments in the world, because if this pandemic doesn't do enough damage, the next one's going to do more. And then the climate crisis, as it comes to a head, is going to make all this look like, you know, a dress rehearsal for the apocalypse instead of the real thing. So we've got to get real about this. We've got to stop making chemical and biological weapons, even if we say it's virus research. So maybe Meryl can comment on, they claim they're going to develop a vaccine for this coronavirus and that it's going to solve everything. Either the Chinese government's going to develop this vaccine or one of these big pharma companies. But is it true that after decades, there's never been an effective, safe and effective vaccine for coronavirus? And what do you think the chances are that we're going to get a safe and effective vaccine in the next year or two for the COVID-19?
So I want to go back and talk about two other things before I get to that. So the first thing I want to say is that the United States, the European Union, Australia, possibly Japan, possibly Singapore, we're all funding this type of research together. Now, I don't know what that means, but when you say all these countries should get together, they already did at a level. I mean, the US labs of Ralph Barrick and Minicherry, his former student, were doing very similar research to what was done in Wuhan, and potentially could have created something like this also. And there may be other labs. And so we don't know where it came from, but there was an international collaboration, and it's critical that we try to dissect what that was all about and why it involved gain of function research rather than truly defensive research. You know, if it was working on drugs and vaccines, good. But if it's working on more pathogenic pathogens, it doesn't make sense. And we need an explanation, and no one has even asked for one yet. Okay, second issue is it is against the law to do research on to create biological weapons. The United States initiated under Nixon in 1969 and 70. Nixon made two declarations that the United States was going to end its biological warfare program and end its toxin warfare program. And we did, and we initiated the Biological Weapons Convention, which was signed by most countries and ratified in 1975. And since then, it has been against international law to develop biological weapons. However, that treaty doesn't have teeth. So you can't just go and inspect another country. The provisions to make that treaty workable were never added. And over the years, there was a mechanism. Every 6 years, there was supposed to be a conference to strengthen the provisions of the treaty. And during the time that I've looked into it, the United States has been the primary country that has stood in the way of creating inspections, verification mechanisms, and sanctions. By sanctions, I mean punishments for countries or individuals who break the law. What's happened is the way the US government has interpreted that treaty since 1975 has changed. And so in 1990, nobody would have said gain of function research is okay, right? But the Defense Department and the Pentagon and White House have sort of kept moving the goalposts about what is acceptable. And we don't know what other countries have done also, but when you have a treaty that cannot be enforced, it makes sense that governments are going to try to get around it. I mean, why wouldn't they? So this is what militaries do. So although it's against the law, and so no American will say they're doing research on biological weapons or, but they've changed the name. It's not biological weapons. Now it's gain of function. And we're only doing it because we want to find out how to defend against it. It's basically the same thing. And, citizens in the US will be confused by what the government alleges and what's actually going on. Now, in terms of the vaccines, okay, let me go back to Fauci. So Fauci has spent a lot of taxpayer money researching these coronaviruses. The most he spent in 1 year was $51 million just on coronavirus. Remember, they caused the common cold. I mean, before SARS-1, who knew that there could be a pandemic? Maybe only Fauci. He spent several hundred millions of dollars of our money researching coronaviruses. Have you ever heard him in any of his hundreds of appearances act as if he knows anything about a coronavirus? The guy has, been probably more influential at getting this research accomplished than anyone perhaps in the world, and he pretends he's completely ignorant. So he needs to be put, on a witness stand, and we need to find out what he knows and when he knew it. All right, now finally, to talk about vaccines. So Fauci, not only was he instrumental in helping to create this organism, it appears to me, he has been absolutely instrumental in preventing us from using effective and safe measures that would turn this pandemic into something that was more like a cold or a mild flu. And that started out with chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. They were known since 2005 to work in the lab against coronaviruses. Very effective. Published in the Journal of Virology, co-authored by CDC scientists in an NIH journal. Fauci knew that the drugs were used in China early on. They showed effectiveness, and yet the WHO in its large clinical trial did not want to use them initially. And when countries said, wait a minute, this looks like a very promising drug, the chloroquines, both chloroquines, we want to use them, then the WHO designed a protocol that poisoned people with doses that were much too high, were potentially lethal, particularly when they were very ill. And so the WHO did a large clinical trial with a dose that was approximately 4 times higher than the normal dose that was known to be potentially lethal by WHO scientists. So the WHO had actually commissioned a report back in 1978 or 82 from someone to figure out what the toxic dose was of chloroquine, and it was identified so the WHO had a report in its file about what the toxic dose was, and then they used that sort of dose. And they did this in a lot of people, probably thousands. The recovery trial in England, probably because the same people were involved in funding these trials. We know that the Bill and Melinda Gates and the Wellcome Trust spent a lot of money funding both of these trials. Recovery used the same dose and managed to kill off a quarter, 25.7, I think, % of the people who were enrolled getting hydroxychloroquine. However, when the drug is used properly and when it's used early, you have 99.7, 99.5% survival. So it's a really good drug. I've used it in 1 to 200 patients myself before COVID. I've used it for lupus and I've used it for Lyme disease. It's a well-known Lyme treatment. It's very safe. It's a very good drug. So I've never seen it really harm anybody except one patient who had taken it for a very long time and had a reaction, and we stopped the drug and she was fine. Anyway, Fauci damned that drug, and the whole media went after Trump when he said it might be a game changer. And Fauci said remdesivir, remdesivir. He actually changed the what are they called? When you have a clinical trial, you have to specify what your endpoints are before you start. Otherwise, you can fake the data. You know, if the data well, we didn't, yeah, it caused a lot of deaths, but oh boy, people got to leave the hospital a few days earlier. If you change it from deaths to how fast they leave the hospital, you might be able to prove prove that the drug is effective when it's not really. So Fauci did that twice in his remdesivir trial. He changed the endpoints in the middle of the trial after looking at the data to see what it showed, said it was effective. And then he and his capo, Clifford Lane, put together a group of so-called experts to create NIH guidelines to then issue guidelines that would affect every doctor in the United States. This is how you treat COVID. And what they said was remdesivir is the standard of care, and practically do not under any circumstances use hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. How did they do that? How could they put together a team that would come up with that? They found 16 of the members of the team who had a financial relationship with the remdesivir company, Gilead. That's how they did it. And they knew how to do it because they have apparently faked other things before. And they've worked together, Fauci and Clifford Lane, for a very long time. So anyway, what happened is not only was the international community somehow at the highest levels getting together to fund gain-of-function coronavirus research, but the international community at some high level was also getting together to push drugs like remdesivir and vaccines, for which there's very little evidence of benefit, and to suppress the use of drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, quercetin, azithromycin, et cetera, drugs for which there's very good evidence of benefit in this condition. And so the use of hydroxychloroquine was not just suppressed in the US. It wasn't just a Trump versus the Democrats issue. It was suppressed in France, where it was in the fall, France began the process, and in January of this year completed it, to take it from being an over-the-counter drug to making it a drug that required a prescription, and then later issuing guidelines that came out of nowhere in France that said doctors could not prescribe it for COVID. In the United States, at the state level, most of the states restricted the use of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine for COVID patients. It is not legal for me to prescribe it prophylactically in my state. That only happened in March through a declaration by the governor. In some states that happened through the pharmacy board. In some states, it happened through a consumer affairs office. No matter, it didn't happen through the doctors. Doctors have never said this drug is unsafe. It's so unsafe that we can't use it to save people with a potentially fatal illness. No doctor organization has come out with that. But all these other politicized boards and governors have forced, and both Democrat and Republican have come out and restricted its use. And this has caused many, many more deaths in the US than was necessary. So we have well, it depends how you calculate the death rate. So I don't want to say that, but we have a relatively high, mortality to identified case rate in the United States. It's around 3%. And many countries have a much lower rate of deaths to cases. And most of those other countries have been using hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine or ivermectin. The conclusion of all this is that Fauci, the FDA, the CDC, and the public health institutions in the United States have knowingly, deliberately caused this pandemic to be prolonged, to be much more serious than it needed to be. And I would say should be criminally liable for stopping doctors from using the best treatments to deal with this condition. And they've threatened the licenses of doctors. They've used all kinds of sneaky way. In the UK, they wrote to every doctor telling them, you know, basically we're going to be looking at you if you prescribe this. In some states, the pharmacy board wrote to the pharmacies and said, you need to snitch on doctors. If they're prescribing this for COVID, we need to know about it. So, so anyway, it's been a very confusing, unprecedented assault on healthcare, not only in the US, but in most of the rest of the Western world. And we need to get to the bottom of that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Meryl. That's really good information. We'll have to have future events. I want to share my screen briefly to show you all the letter from scientists and lawyers and policymakers on gain-of-function research. So if you are a medical doctor, a scientist, a lawyer, if you run an organization and you'd like to join in with this, we'll put this in the link and you can join. Please share with others. And essentially, the message of this, I'll read just one little piece of this letter. Even before COVID-19, numerous incidents, leaks, thefts, security lapses, and deliberate releases, such as the 2001 anthrax attacks involving smallpox, anthrax, bird flu, and SARS, escaping from some of the top US, Chinese, Russian, and other laboratories across the world, alerted scientists to the failability of even the most secure laboratories, reinforcing the urgent need for a thorough reassessment of biosafety. And so this letter is to call for a global moratorium on any so-called gain-of-function experiments that make pathogens more liable to cause a pandemic. So I hope that everyone watching now will share this conversation that we had with Dr. Meryl Nass and Ronnie Cummins, Director of Organic Consumers Association, and also help us share this letter. And we will have future events. Hopefully we'll be able to get Dr. Meryl Nass to come back with us to discuss these other pressing issues. Are we dealing with COVID-19 properly? Was it right to push aside known treatments like hydroxychloroquine and instead promote untested but perhaps highly profitable products like remdesivir, like Gilead's remdesivir? So we'll be having more conversations on this topic of the pandemic, of how it originated, what we need to do about the possibility that this is a man-made virus that escaped from a lab, and our own discussion about how to deal with pandemics like COVID-19. God forbid there be another one, but as long as this dangerous research and the covert biological weapons work that seems to be done by countries, including the United States and China, if this continues, we may have to face future pandemics. So it's a lot that we covered today. Please, again, share this video and get the word out. Bring people to Organic Consumers Association's video page. You'll be able to re-watch this or share this video. We have other conversations with scientists on this topic, and we will certainly do more in the future. So thank you so much, Dr. Meryl Nass, for being with us today. Thank you, Ronnie Cummins of Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International. And this conversation is to be continued. And thanks everybody who participated today. Bye-bye.
All right. Success.